It began as an ordinary session, at least as ordinary as it could be for a man like Edgar, whose life defied the limits of conventional human understanding. On that particular day, he entered his usual deep trance, prepared to deliver a reading for a client who was physically located a few blocks away in a hospital. Cayce had performed thousands of these readings before, often diagnosing illnesses or offering spiritual guidance while his physical body lay still and quiet. But something happened in that session that neither he nor his small team could have ever anticipated. It was the moment reality cracked open, and Cayce's consciousness slipped past the veil, separating the living from the dead. Unbeknownst to those in the room at the time, the man Cayce was preparing to give a reading for had just died, moments before the session began. And yet, Cayce proceeded as if nothing had changed, or rather, he proceeded because everything had changed. As he settled deeper into his trance, his voice, calm, slow, and otherworldly, began to narrate something no one had heard before. He wasn't diagnosing an illness, he wasn't interpreting dreams. He was witnessing a soul's departure. He was describing, in real time, the immediate experiences of a consciousness that had just been released from the physical form. The astonished stenographer recorded every word, every phrase Cayce spoke. His words were precise, unnervingly detailed, and unlike anything he'd previously described, this wasn't conjecture. This wasn't symbolic. This was something he was seeing, experiencing. He described the soul's awareness lifting from the body, not with fear or panic, but with a strange and sacred calm. It was as though the soul knew what was happening even before the mind had fully grasped it. The physical body was no longer the point of reference. The soul hovered, momentarily disoriented, then suddenly crystal clear, as though awakening from a long, burdensome sleep. Cayce explained that the soul did not instantly drift into some unknown oblivion, but instead paused. It paused to observe, to recognize. The body it had once occupied lay below, and yet the soul felt no fear in releasing it. There was a stillness in those first seconds that Cayce described as more profound than anything known in the physical world. A silence that wasn't empty, but full, charged with knowledge, clarity, and the echo of spiritual truth that most people spend their lives trying to remember. Then something even more remarkable unfolded. Cayce described what the soul saw next, a cord of light, brilliant, silvery, and pulsing with vitality. This cord, which he later called the silver cord, connected the soul to the body it had just left. Not as a chain of imprisonment, but as a gentle tether, holding open the gate between two realms for just a moment longer. In this moment, the soul had a choice. It could remain tethered for a brief time, observing, understanding, integrating, or it could sever the cord, completing its release and moving fully into the next plane. But this soul hesitated, not out of fear, but because there was something sacred happening. It was as though the soul was taking inventory of all it had been, all it had experienced. Cayce noted how the soul began to sense a shift in perception. Time lost meaning, space bent inward, everything became immediate. This was not linear recollection, this was multi-dimensional presence. The soul wasn't remembering its life, it was reliving it, all at once, and not from its own perspective, but through the eyes and hearts of every person it had touched. Even Cayce, accustomed to extraordinary spiritual insights, was taken aback by what he was witnessing. His voice wavered for a moment as he described the soul experiencing love it had given and love it had rejected. It saw the ripple effects of a single kind word, the long echo of a careless insult. The soul felt joy it had caused in others, and the pain it had unknowingly inflicted. It was not judgment, it was truth. Undeniable, compassionate, but inescapable truth. In this sacred unfolding, the soul was not being punished or praised. It was simply seeing, feeling, and knowing, in full. The reading continued as Cayce described the soul recognizing other presences, non-physical beings whose energy felt like both family and home. Some of these entities had been long forgotten in physical memory, while others were never known in life at all, yet felt inexplicably familiar. There was a welcome. Not a parade, not a spectacle, but an intimate recognition, a nod between souls, a silent acknowledgement that this being had completed something precious, something difficult, and something beautiful. But what made this session so transformative wasn't just that Cayce had seen it, was that he had felt it. After emerging from his trance, the atmosphere in the room was electric. His assistant sat in stunned silence, unsure of what to say. Cayce himself was quiet, not because he was unsure of what had happened, but because he knew. He had gone somewhere few have ever glimpsed. He had followed a soul, not just to the edge, but through the doorway. And what he brought back was a sacred map of transition, of awareness, of spiritual continuity. Word of the reading spread through the Cayce circles quickly. For many, it confirmed their deepest hopes, that death was not a vanishing, but an unveiling. That what waits beyond is not punishment or chaos, but clarity and choice. Others were skeptical, unsure how one man could access such profound knowledge in real time. But those who knew Cayce, those who had seen the accuracy of his readings, the humility in his heart, the consistency of his spiritual teachings, they knew this was not a performance, it was a gift. A rare glimpse behind the veil, offered not to sensationalize death, but to illuminate life. In the months that followed, Cayce continued to reference that session, subtly at first, then more openly. He explained that the soul's journey after death was not fixed or arbitrary, but shaped entirely by one's spiritual preparation. The man whose death he had witnessed had not been a saint, but he had lived with integrity, with care, and with reflection. His soul's passage was gentle, conscious, and filled with purpose. Cayce believed this was available to everyone, not just the enlightened, but to anyone willing to live with spiritual intent. The session became a cornerstone of Cayce's teachings on death and the afterlife. It was the moment that changed everything, not just for him, but for thousands who would later read the transcript and realize that they, too, were more than their bodies, that the first 60 seconds after death were not the closing of a door, but the opening of a portal. That consciousness survives, expands, and continues, carrying forward every choice, every lesson, every act of love. And perhaps most importantly, it proved one thing above all, that death, as we fear it, is a misunderstanding. What Cayce witnessed that day was not an ending, but a transformation. Not darkness, but awakening. Not loss, but reunion. The reading that began as routine became a sacred initiation, for him, for the soul he followed, and for every seeker who would one day learn that their first 60 seconds after death are more important, more beautiful, and more alive than they could ever imagine. The moment your heart stops beating is not the end. It is, in fact, the beginning of something far more expansive than anything the mind could comprehend while still tethered to the physical world. According to the thousands of readings given by Edgar Cayce, what happens in that very first second, after the final breath, is nothing short of a revelation. It is what he called the moment of great awakening. And it unfolds with such clarity, intensity, and divine precision that it forever alters the soul's perception of reality. This is the instant when all illusions fall away, and the soul begins to see not with eyes, but with knowing. In that first second after physical death, there is no blinding flash or dramatic cinematic fade to black. Instead, there is expansion. Cayce described this initial moment as a dissolving of boundaries, a soft but undeniable detachment from the body. But it is not a detachment that feels cold or distant, it feels liberating, as though something that was once tightly bound is suddenly set free. The soul does not panic, there is no struggle. Instead, there is a strange familiarity, like waking up from a dream and slowly realizing you are home. For many, that first second is met with confusion, not fear, but a momentary disorientation. Time has stopped behaving in a linear fashion. The senses, once limited by biology, have begun to stretch. You are no longer breathing, but you are aware. You no longer hear in the conventional sense, but you perceive with clarity that goes beyond sound. Cayce described this awareness as spherical, not directed outward through limited sensory organs, but radiating in all directions, perceiving everything at once. The body that once defined your identity lies still, and yet you remain, watching, observing, existing. This observation often triggers a strange recognition. You were never the body to begin with. It had been your vessel, your home, your tool, but it was never you, and in that first second, that realization arrives not as a philosophical idea, but as absolute truth. You feel yourself as soul for the first time without interference. There is a purity to it, a remembering, a great exhale from the soul as if it had been holding its breath for a lifetime. But something even more profound happens. Cayce explained that within that instant of expanded awareness, the soul often experiences what he called a great light. This is not light in the way we experience sunlight or electricity. This is a living light, intelligent, gentle, and overwhelming in its warmth. Some souls describe it as a presence. Others simply recognize it as the source. But it is never threatening. It is like standing before a mirror that reflects not your appearance, but your essence. The soul recognizes this light, and in recognizing it, it remembers its origin. This recognition is often accompanied by an overwhelming sense of love, not the emotional kind, but something much more foundational, a type of love that is, in this moment, many souls feel a wave of understanding wash over them. They see the truth of their life, not through judgment, but through alignment. There is no voice booming with condemnation. There is no tribunal. There is only awareness. Layer after layer peeling back the story of who you believed you were to reveal the soul you truly are. Cayce often emphasized that this expansion doesn't overwhelm the soul, it clarifies. The confusion that may arise in those initial seconds quickly gives way to lucidity. The soul begins to remember the spiritual principles it once knew but had temporarily forgotten during physical incarnation. It understands that physical life was not a punishment or a test, but an opportunity, a classroom for the soul's growth. And now, that class has ended. But the learning continues. What strikes most souls in this moment, Cayce noted, is how familiar it all feels. Like stepping into a place you didn't know you missed until you returned. The boundaries of self begin to shift. You no longer identify as a name, a job, a role, or even a personality. You are presence, consciousness. You are aware of everything you've ever been, but no longer trapped by the narratives. Instead, you see them from a higher vantage point. But this doesn't mean the soul becomes impersonal or detached. Quite the opposite. The soul remembers the people it loved, the experiences it cherished, the moments that shaped its development. But now, it sees those moments in full context. What was once confusing becomes clear. What was once painful becomes purposeful. The moment of great awakening is not about forgetting who you were, but about fully becoming who you've always been beyond the illusions. For some, this first second can also bring a wave of emotion, not sadness, but a deep longing to integrate what was learned in physical life. Cayce said that the soul, in that moment, often feels a surge of appreciation, too, and the sighs. For the challenges, the triumphs, the laughter, and even the suffering. It understands that everything played a role in its awakening. Nothing was wasted, nothing was random. It all fit into a spiritual mosaic now visible from the other side. There is also a realization of continuity. Death is not a break in the journey. It is a step forward. The soul becomes aware that it has done this before, many times, and will likely do it again. But this time, it carries with it the wisdom earned from a lifetime, and in that first second, the soul also senses choice, not imposed destiny, but sacred possibility. It begins to feel the tug of direction. Will it move forward into higher dimensions? Will it linger in the borderlands? Will it return in another form, or serve in the spiritual realms, guiding others who are still on the path? These are not decisions made with ego, fear, or desire. They are chosen with clarity, alignment, and deep understanding. Cayce emphasized that the soul's free will does not end with death, it expands. The more spiritually prepared a soul is before passing, the more gracefully and consciously it navigates this moment. For those who cultivated prayer, meditation, selflessness, or service, this moment can be transcendent. For those who lived purely in material or fearful mindsets, it can be disorienting, but never punished, only matched in resonance. Cayce recounted how some souls in that first second see guides, beings of light, often familiar, who stand at the periphery, not intruding, but waiting to assist. These presences are not angels in the traditional sense, but advanced souls, perhaps former relatives, friends, or mentors from this or other lifetimes. Their presence often brings peace. It communicates silently, reassuring the newly transitioned soul that it is safe, seen, and loved beyond comprehension. And then there is the most powerful truth of all. In that first second, the soul understands that nothing is truly lost. The love it shared, the lives it touched, the intentions it held, they are not gone. They are recorded in the very fabric of consciousness. They continue to echo, ripple, and evolve. Death did not erase them, it expanded them. The soul becomes aware that it is not alone, never was, and never will be. Connection is eternal. Cayce called this awakening a sacred flashpoint, a divine threshold where the soul regains its original vision. It is not always easy, it is not always gentle, but it is always truthful. And in that truth, there is freedom. The soul, now bathed in light, buoyed by love, and clarified by awareness, prepares for what comes next. It has crossed the boundary between flesh and spirit, and found that life does not end. It only becomes more real. So the first second after death is not death at all, it is awakening. It is the moment your soul remembers what the world made you forget. And in that remembrance, you are reborn into the fullness of what you always were, eternal, radiant, and profoundly alive. There's a reason so many near-death experiences describe light, not shadow. Why those who return speak not of oblivion, but of brilliance. According to Edgar Cayce's readings, the moment of death is not a descent into darkness, but a transition into light, an awakening so radiant and all-encompassing that the soul is overwhelmed not by fear, but by recognition. The idea that death is cold, black, or void-like is a misunderstanding rooted in physical perception. Cayce's descriptions, grounded in thousands of trance state sessions, revealed again and again that leaving the body is not like falling asleep, it is like stepping into the sun after lifetimes spent in dim candlelight. Cayce's accounts make it abundantly clear. The body is not who you are. It is the container, the vehicle, the temporary cloak worn for the sake of learning and experience. At the moment of death, this cloak is shed. But unlike the sadness with which we usually imagine departure, the soul experiences release as relief, a lightening of burden, as if a great weight has been lifted from the chest. There is no confusion about what's happening. The soul doesn't fight, it flows, it rises, not with resistance, but with surrender, and that surrender is met immediately with light. This light is not metaphor. Cayce described it as a real phenomenon, one that the newly transitioned soul perceives not just with spiritual eyes, but with the fullness of its being. It is not a spotlight, nor a tunnel, though it can take these forms if that's what the soul expects. More accurately, it is a field of radiance, a living intelligence that surrounds and welcomes. It does not blind, it envelops, it communicates without words. You are home. And in that moment, the soul understands. It knows that it has stepped out of density and into clarity. It has crossed a threshold where limitation falls away and essence begins to shine. There is a distinct sense of elevation, as if the soul is floating upward, though in truth, space itself has ceased to behave in physical terms. The soul no longer moves through space, eyesight, it moves within light. This light has no center and no edge. It is all around and within, and it imparts a knowing that goes beyond information. It is truth experienced directly. And the soul, no longer dulled by material illusion, becomes increasingly lucid with each moment that passes. What Cayce found most fascinating was how souls consistently describe this light as familiar, not foreign, not distant. It is not an alien force, but a long-lost friend, a remembered origin. The soul recognizes the light not as something outside itself, but as something it had always carried within. In life, it had been dimmed by fear, distraction, and the illusion of separation. In death, that illusion dissolves, and what is left is unity. Leaving the body behind is not traumatic for the soul, it's natural, organic. In many of Cayce's readings, souls were described as surprised not by death itself, but by how peaceful and painless the transition was. For those who had been ill or suffering, death brought instantaneous relief. The physical pain vanished like a fog evaporating in sunlight. In one case, Cayce described a soul who, just moments before, had been racked with pain in a hospital bed. Upon leaving the body, the soul felt weightless, whole and radiant, observing its former body with no attachment, not only gratitude for the lessons it had helped deliver. Some souls look back, others don't, but those who do often do so without fear or sadness. They see the body as a completed project, a chapter closed, a vessel honored for what it made possible. There is no regret in leaving it behind, only a profound sense of continuity. The soul realizes that it has not ended, it has simply stepped out of costume. The life that seemed so absolute from the ground suddenly appears as one brief, beautiful scene in an eternal play. Cayce also emphasized that the amount of light a soul perceives upon leaving the body is influenced by its spiritual readiness. Those who lived with consciousness, who cultivated awareness, love, service, or communion with higher forces, often found themselves surrounded by intense, welcoming light. Souls who were deeply attached to the material world, or who passed with fear or trauma, sometimes experienced a more muted transition. Not darkness, but a fog, a grayness. A waiting room, not a punishment. The light was still there, but it had to be reached by releasing resistance. In all cases, though, the light remained constant. It did not judge, it did not withhold. It simply was. The soul either opened to it or hesitated, and that hesitation was never permanent. Cayce made it clear, all souls eventually move toward the light. It is their nature to do so. The darkness we fear is not death, it is the disconnection we carry while alive. Death ends that disconnection. It dissolves the boundary between the seen and unseen, the known and the forgotten. It brings the soul back to center. Another detail Cayce revealed is how the light carries with it sound. Not the sound we hear with ears, but a kind of harmonic resonance, a music of the spheres. Some souls described it as a hum, a vibration, a tone that reached into their very being and reminded them of who they were before time. This sound, inseparable from the light, initiates the soul into its next phase. It is not random, it is sacred geometry in motion. It is the first language of the soul, and hearing it again fills the being with peace beyond comprehension. For those who feared death in life, this moment is perhaps the most healing. The realization that death is not falling, failing, or vanishing, but rising, remembering, and returning, completely dissolves lifetimes of anxiety. The soul understands that it was never in danger, that the entire earthly experience, while incredibly real and often intense, was held in the hands of something immeasurably greater than itself. And now, within the light, that something is no longer abstract, it is present, personal, undeniable. One of Cayce's most moving cases involved a woman who had spent her life fearing death after the sudden loss of her child. She carried grief like armor, shielding herself from joy for fear it would be taken away again. When she passed, Cayce gave a reading that revealed her soul's transition as one of immediate joy and reunion. In the light, her child was waiting, not as a ghost or memory, but as a radiant being, grown and evolved, greeting her not with sadness, but with love. The light, in this case, was the bridge between them, and through it, the soul not only shed fear, but healed it completely. This is what Cayce wanted the world to understand, that the fear of death comes from the illusion that we are the body, that we are separate, that we are alone, but in truth, we are none of those things. And the instant we step into the light, we remember. We remember that the self we thought we were is only a small fraction of what we are. That the world we thought was all there is was only the surface. That we are, and always have been, light in motion. Leaving the body is not an end, it's a beginning. The body was your anchor, your tool, your doorway into form. But you were never in it, you were always through it. And when the time comes to let it go, you rise, you expand, you illuminate, not because you earned it through perfection, but because it is your nature. You are light, and in death, that light is no longer hidden. This understanding shifts everything. It transforms the way we live, because if we know, truly know, that death is stepping into brilliance, not blackness, then we are free. Free to live with courage, free to love without reservation, free to explore, serve, forgive, and evolve, knowing that what awaits us is not judgment, but remembrance. Not punishment, but reunion. Not darkness, but light. And in that light, we finally come home. Death, as most people imagine it, is cloaked in darkness, not a moment of vanishing, of silence, of slipping into an unknowable void. But in Edgar Cayce's readings, the reality is far more luminous. Contrary to our deepest fears and cultural conditioning, the moment of death is not a descent into blackness, but an emergence into light, like a living, pulsing brilliance that surrounds the soul with overwhelming peace and clarity. For those who have prepared spiritually, this transition isn't frightening, it's liberating. It's like stepping through a thin curtain and finding yourself in a place that feels more like home than any location you've ever known. It is not falling, not ending, but expanding into something unimaginably vast and radiant. In Cayce's trance state sessions, he repeatedly described what happens to the soul at the moment it leaves the body. What stands out most in his accounts is the sheer brilliance of the transition. The instant the soul detaches from the physical form, it becomes aware of a light, not a metaphorical glow or imagined warmth, but a real, conscious presence. This light is not something external to the soul, but something the soul recognizes from before birth. It is familiar, like a parent's embrace or a childhood scent, something so embedded in the being's core that it bypasses all fear. The moment the soul perceives this light, it remembers. It remembers that it is eternal, that it has existed long before the current life, and that it is returning to a realm it never truly left. Cayce emphasized that the act of leaving the body feels nothing like dying in the way we understand it. The body may appear to be shutting down, breath slowing, heartbeat ceasing, but for the soul, the sensation is one of weightlessness and release. It is like finally slipping free from a tight-fitting garment, a coat worn for decades, and suddenly realizing how heavy it had been. The soul lifts, gently, without violence, without confusion, as if rising on a current of energy that had always been there, waiting. It may hover briefly, observing the body it once inhabited, not with attachment or sadness, but with neutrality, like a craftsman acknowledging the completion of a well-used tool. The light, described in numerous readings, begins to envelop the soul. But this light is not static or cold. It is alive, intelligent, warm, and profoundly loving. It radiates with a frequency that communicates directly to the soul's consciousness. There are no words, no language, yet the soul understands everything. The light says, "You are safe, you are known, you are loved." And the soul, in its newly expanded awareness, responds not with fear, but with relief, with surrender, with awe. This light is not unfamiliar. It is the very essence the soul was forged from. And to step into it is not to end, but to return. What many find surprising in Cayce's readings is that the soul doesn't experience this light passively. It engages with it. It becomes more itself inside it. While the physical body constrained thought, feeling, and perception, the soul in the light becomes multidimensional. It remembers other lifetimes. It senses the presence of loved ones long since departed. It recognizes guides, beings of higher consciousness, who have waited patiently, respectfully, until the soul was ready to see them again. These presences are not shadowy figures or abstract energies. They are radiant, deeply personal, and often carry the emotional familiarity of a friend you once knew but had forgotten. Cayce also described how the quality of the light can shift depending on the soul's level of readiness. For those who lived consciously, not perfectly, but with effort toward kindness, reflection, and inner growth, now, the light is immediate, clear, and welcoming. For those who were deeply entangled in fear, anger, or material obsession, the light may seem dim or distant at first, not because it is being withheld, but because the soul is temporarily veiled from it by its own lingering attachments. In those cases, the soul must gradually release its resistance. 9. And as it does, the light grows stronger. Cayce was clear: no soul is denied the light. It is not a reward, but a birthright. The only variable is how quickly the soul can attune itself to it. He once gave a reading for a woman whose husband had passed suddenly in his sleep. She had been haunted by the thought that he was alone, lost in some formless void. But Cayce's reading told a different story, a story of immediate clarity, of his soul being greeted by a light so familiar that he wept with joy. The soul, Cayce explained, often meets the light with the emotion of homecoming, not the excitement of novelty, but the quiet, deep peace of return. It is the feeling you get when you walk into a place that smells like your past, feels like your truth, and erases the ache you never realized you carried. Another key point from Cayce's accounts is that the light isn't just a destination, it's a bridge. It allows the soul to understand not just where it is now, but who it truly is and who it has been. Within this light, the soul undergoes its first wave of spiritual clarity. It sees its former life, not in punishing detail, but in illuminating context. This review isn't a lecture, it's a revelation. The light shows how every moment mattered, how every thought, word, and action left an imprint, and yet, the soul is not judged. It is simply shown, light cell, by the light itself, what it created, what it learned, what it still seeks to grow through. For some, this moment includes a powerful realization that the light is not only around them but within them. The boundary between the soul and the light dissolves. The two are not separate. The soul is an extension of the light, sentia, a unique, conscious beam of it, temporarily expressed in physical form. Cayce often described this realization as the moment of deep spiritual freedom. The soul, understanding its divine nature, is no longer afraid of what lies ahead. It knows that it cannot be destroyed, that death was never an end but a doorway, and that the light it stepped into had been quietly guiding it all along. This understanding reframes everything we think we know about death. It is not a fall, it is a rising, not a closure, but an expansion. And for those who have glimpsed it, either through Cayce's words, near-death experiences, or moments of spiritual awakening, it becomes impossible to return to the old, fear-based views. The truth is simple and profound. We are not walking toward extinction. We are returning to brilliance. And that brilliance is more beautiful, more intelligent, and more loving than we are capable of imagining while still within the confines of the body. Cayce wanted people to live with this knowledge, not just die into it. To realize that the same light awaits us all, and that our task is to prepare not by fearing death, but by living in harmony with that light now. Every act of love brings us closer to it. Every choice to forgive, every moment of awareness, every surrender to truth, every time, all of it strengthens the soul's ability to recognize the light when the time comes. And when it does, the soul will not be surprised. It will step forward. It will remember. It will shine. This is why Cayce insisted that the greatest mystery is not what happens after we die, but how we live knowing that we are already eternal. The moment we leave the body, we are not fading, we are illuminating. We are becoming what we were before the world made us forget. And in that instant, we don't fear the light, we become it. In the first few moments after death, as the soul begins its liberation from the physical form, something extraordinary happens. It is not a fantasy, it is not poetic imagination. It is a phenomenon described again and again in the trance state readings of Edgar Cayce, and later echoed by those who've returned from near-death experiences with haunting clarity. Cayce called it the Silver Cord Review, an event so profound, so intimate, that it redefines everything we believe about who we are, what we've done, and how we've affected the world around us. This is not simply a replay of your life. It is a re-experiencing of it, not from your point of view, but from the countless others whose lives your presence touched, for better or for worse. The silver cord, as described in sacred texts and Cayce's readings alike, is a shimmering filament of light that connects the soul to the body. It is energetic, not visible to the naked eye, but absolutely real in the metaphysical dimension. At the moment of death, the cord loosens. And in the seconds that follow, just as the soul rises into the realm of expanded awareness, this cord serves one last purpose. It acts as a bridge to memory, empathy, and reckoning. It holds together the full record of the life just lived, not just the events, but the emotional consequences of those events rippling outward into others. This is where the life review begins, and why it changes the soul forever. Cayce emphasized that this review is not like watching a movie. It's not passive. You don't simply see your life unfold from birth to death like an old reel of film. You feel it. You re-inhabit moments. But more astonishingly, you experience those moments from the perspectives of others, people you loved, people you hurt, people you never even noticed. You experience the joy your words brought to a friend on a difficult day, but you also feel the sting of a dismissive comment you barely remember making, only now you feel it from the heart of the one who heard it. You live again, but through eyes not your own. Imagine smiling at a stranger in a grocery store line, thinking nothing of it. In the silver cord review, you may find yourself suddenly inside that stranger's awareness. 9. Feeling the warmth and unexpected comfort of a gesture they desperately needed but never told anyone about. Or imagine the time you raised your voice in anger at a child. In this review, you don't just recall the event, you feel the fear, the confusion, the smallness that echoed inside them because of your words. And you don't experience these things with shame or guilt imposed from outside. You experience them from a place of deep, undeniable knowing, because you have momentarily become the other. This level of spiritual empathy is unlike anything the physical mind can comprehend. In the physical world, we are bound by perspective, by self-interest, by memory distorted through time and emotion. But in the silver cord review, the soul is stripped of those filters. It sees without defense. It remembers without distortion. There are no justifications, no rationalizations, no excuses. Only truth, raw, clean, and absolute. But even then, there is no judgment, no punitive God hurling lightning bolts, no courtroom in the sky, only the soul, confronted with the full measure of its own ripple effect. Cayce described this process as simultaneously humbling and liberating. It is humbling because it reveals the weight of even the smallest actions. The moments you thought didn't matter, they mattered. The words you tossed out in haste, the silence you offered when someone needed to be heard, the compassion you withheld, or the forgiveness you extended. All of it lives on, recorded not in books or scrolls, but in the hearts of others, MTBs, and the spiritual memory of your own soul. But it's also liberating, because in this experience, you see that you were never powerless, you mattered more than you realized. You left footprints where you thought you were invisible, and some of those footprints became turning points in other people's lives. There is something deeply holy about this. The review does not come with condemnation, it comes with clarity, and in that clarity, a kind of sacred sorrow arises, not the sorrow of punishment, but of awareness. You see where you failed to love, not because someone is yelling at you about it, but because you finally feel what that absence of love created in another soul. And once you feel that, you can't unfeel it. It stays with you, it reshapes you, it becomes the soil for future growth. Because this review is not just about understanding, it's about evolution. In one of Cayce's documented readings, a soul was described moving through its review and pausing on a moment where it had spoken harshly to a co-worker. In life, it had thought nothing of it. A simple disagreement in a stressful environment. But in the review, the soul saw how that moment became the beginning of a spiral for the other person, a loss of confidence, a missed opportunity, and eventually, a quiet withdrawal from their own dreams. The soul wept, not out of shame but out of awakened love it wished it had expressed then. And yet, even in this sorrow, there was no punishment. Only the invitation to learn, to do better, to carry this awareness into whatever came next. The review is not chronological, it is layered, emotional, and multidimensional. A single act of kindness may unfold like a blooming flower, revealing branches of consequences you never saw in life. A single betrayal may send ripples across generations, and while this can be overwhelming, the soul is never alone during the process. Cayce spoke of guides, higher beings of compassion and wisdom, who stand with the soul during the review, not to scold or praise, but to support and anchor. They serve as gentle witnesses, helping the soul integrate what it sees without collapsing under the weight of it. And perhaps the most miraculous aspect of the Silver Cord Review is that it allows the soul to forgive itself. After seeing what it has done, on both the beautiful and the broken, the soul also sees why it did those things. It remembers the fear it carried, the wounds it hadn't healed, the love it didn't know how to give. This doesn't excuse anything, but it explains everything. The soul begins to understand that life was not a test it failed or passed, it was a journey of increasing awareness, and that everything it experienced, even its mistakes, became part of its spiritual education. There is healing in this, profound, cellular-level healing. The soul, now stripped of illusion and bolstered by truth, begins to feel a surge of intention rising. It wants to do better, to become more, to serve. This is the moment when many souls make their next choice, whether to return to the physical plane in another incarnation, to remain in spiritual realms as a guide, or to move deeper into higher dimensions of learning. But whatever the path, the review has served its sacred purpose. It has shown the soul what it created, 1901, and what it can now choose to become. Cayce believed that this experience was not only inevitable, but merciful. It was the soul's birthright to understand itself, to see the full picture, to grow in compassion. And perhaps more importantly, he taught that knowing this now, while still alive, can change everything. If you understand that one day you will see your life through the eyes of those you've affected, you begin to live differently. You speak more gently, you act more mindfully, you love more openly. Not out of fear of judgment, but out of alignment with who you truly are beneath the mask of personality, a soul, radiant and powerful, capable of shaping realities with every word and gesture. The Silver Cord Review is not a punishment, it is a gift. It is the soul's great reckoning with truth, offered not to shame, but to awaken. And in that awakening, the soul begins to understand what it had forgotten during its time in the body. That love is the only thing that matters, that every moment is an opportunity to give it or withhold it, and that nothing is ever lost in the grand tapestry of human connection. All is seen, all is felt, all is known, and in the end, all becomes the light we return to. He was a man of figures, logic, and transactions, a successful businessman from Kentucky in the early 1930s who had spent his life calculating risks, managing employees, expanding his wealth, and ensuring the precision of every deal. To those who knew him, he was respectable, diligent, perhaps even generous by worldly standards. But like many who build their legacy on material foundations, his focus had always been outward on profits, growth, and reputation. What he hadn't considered, what hadn't entered his field of concern in any meaningful way, was the invisible emotional and spiritual footprint he was leaving behind. That would change the moment his heart stopped and his soul crossed into the realm beyond. It was during a near-death experience, what at the time had no clinical name or recognition, that this man found himself hovering outside his body. He had collapsed from a sudden health event, and as medical professionals worked urgently to revive him, his soul slipped loose from the form it had so tightly inhabited. He later described the moment not as terrifying, but curiously serene, as though stepping into a strange, quiet clarity. It was during this liminal time that Edgar Cayce, the renowned sleeping prophet, was asked to give a reading on the man's condition. But what emerged from Cayce's trance state was something far beyond diagnosis. It was a detailed, breathtaking account of the businessman's soul review, a first-hand witness to the astonishing process of reliving one's life through the consciousness of others. Cayce's voice, while in trance, described how the man's soul began to enter what is known as the life review, a phenomenon he had detailed in many other readings. But this particular case was remarkable for its emotional intensity. What began as a simple observation of past events quickly evolved into something deeply immersive and humbling. The businessman did not just see his life flash before him like images on a screen. He felt it. And more significantly, he felt everyone else's experience of him, IZT, something he had never considered while alive. The first wave came not from his family or his closest associates, but from those he had barely noticed, the janitor he passed every morning without acknowledgement, the waitress he dismissed with a wave of his hand while talking business over lunch, the receptionist whose name he never learned but who had quietly admired his perseverance. These were small moments to him, insignificant, transactional, routine, but in the soul review they were alive again. He could feel the sting of being unseen, the heaviness of being treated like part of the background. He felt the soft hopefulness the receptionist carried each day that maybe, just maybe, she mattered to those she served, and he felt it dim a little each time he walked past without a glance. Next came the employees, the men and women whose livelihoods he managed, evaluated, hired and sometimes fired without a second thought. From their perspectives, he relived late nights spent agonizing over job performance, the whispered conversations about his temper, the fear that came with a summons to his office, but he also felt their admiration, yes, even their gratitude, for the opportunities he had provided, for the times when his decisiveness had steered the company out of danger, for the bonuses handed out during a particularly fruitful quarter. He experienced the pride they felt when praised, the quiet devastation when criticized, and the ripple of their emotions when he made decisions without considering their humanity. Perhaps the most poignant moment of his review came when he entered the awareness of his son. The businessman had always thought of himself as a provider. He had ensured that his children had the best education, the best home, and access to every opportunity. But in the review, he became his son, a boy sitting at the dinner table, watching his father buried in paperwork, never making eye contact. He felt the ache of waiting for attention that never arrived, the yearning for approval that came only through achievement, and the confusing silence of a man who showed love only through financial security. He felt his son's joy at a rare compliment, and the pain when that joy was short-lived, overridden by the next demand for perfection. The review unfolded like this for what felt like an eternity, moment after moment, person after person, emotional echo after emotional echo. The businessman didn't just observe his life, he absorbed it. He relived it through 1,000 hearts, through countless breaths and glances and unspoken words. He realized that his actions, no matter how rationalized in life, had sent waves into other people's realities. Some were gentle, some were sharp, some left wounds that never fully healed. But he also saw the good. He remembered an intern he once mentored, a quiet young man with little confidence. He had taken the time to explain a financial principle, not because it was required, but because the intern had asked with sincere curiosity. In the review, he felt the rush of inspiration that moment gave the young man, how it shifted his trajectory, how it lit a spark that eventually led him to pursue his own career in finance. That one brief encounter had shaped a life, and the businessman had forgotten it entirely, until now. Cayce emphasized that the businessman's review was not delivered with punishment or cruelty. There was no scolding, no divine wrath, only truth, experienced in full. And in that truth, the man's soul began to transform. He felt an overwhelming urge to return, not to restore wealth or reputation, but to express something he had only begun to understand: compassion. He longed to speak the words he had withheld, to offer the kindness he had never prioritized, to touch the people he had walked past as though they were invisible. Not to be virtuous or moral, but because he had felt them now, and he could not unfeel them. When he was revived, his physical body re-entered the world, shaken and changed. Those around him noticed it immediately. He no longer spoke about profit margins or expansion strategies with the same fervor. Instead, he began writing personal notes to employees. He paused in hallways to ask people how they were doing, and listened. He reached out to estranged family members. He told his son he was proud of him, not for any particular achievement, but simply for who he was. He wept during these conversations, often unable to explain exactly why. But the truth was this: he had seen behind the curtain, and he now understood that life is not measured by the contracts we sign or the goals we hit, but by the hearts we touch, and how we touch them. The reading Cayce gave was later studied and retold by those exploring the afterlife and spiritual growth. It served as a living example of how a single soul's awakening could ripple outward into a new life of meaning, service, and connection. It also served as a warning, not of punishment, but of awareness, that every moment we live is recorded not in some ledger of right and wrong, but in the felt experiences of those around us. And one day, we will meet ourselves through their eyes. The businessman's case became a sacred story in Cayce's archive, not because it was unique, but because it was universal. All of us are living lives that will one day be re-experienced through others. All of us are casting shadows and light with our words, our choices, our silences, and when the time comes to leave the body and step into the full awareness of the soul, we will not be asked what we built or earned, we will be shown who we were, reflected in the souls we impacted. And if we're wise, we won't wait until death to realize it. We'll begin now, while there's still time, to live with the awareness that every encounter matters. Every person is a mirror. Every choice a thread in a fabric much larger than we can see. The businessman was given a second chance. We all are, every day. And perhaps the most lasting wealth we can build is not found in banks or ledgers, but in the unseen moments of grace we offer to others, moments we'll one day feel, fully, through their eyes. After the sweeping depth of the life review, after the soul has seen itself through the eyes of every person it ever impacted, felt the echoes of every intention, and understood the ripple of every gesture, there comes a stillness, not the silence of absence, but the quiet of great anticipation. It is here, in this luminous pause beyond death, that the soul is faced with something that few understand happens, a choice, not a judgment imposed by any external being, not a sentence passed down by divine authority, but a sacred crossroads, one that the soul must navigate with full awareness of what it has been, what it has learned, and what it longs to become. This is what Edgar Cayce called the Great Choice, and it is one of the most extraordinary revelations found within his thousands of trance state readings. The soul does not arrive at this moment confused or uninformed. By the time this threshold is reached, it has already shed the veil of physical limitation. It has seen itself without distortion. It has been illuminated by the truth of its own actions and intentions. There is no hiding here, but neither is there condemnation. There is only pure knowing, and from that knowing arises the next movement. A soul cannot linger indefinitely in the space between. The spiritual realms are not static holding pens. They are living fields of energy, purpose, and vibration. And every soul, by its very nature, seeks motion. It must choose to move forward into higher planes of learning, to return to the physical realm for further development, or to remain in the borderlands near Earth to fulfill a purpose not yet complete. This moment is often misunderstood in conventional ideas about the afterlife. In many belief systems, the next destination of the soul is seen as predetermined, heaven or hell, ascension or damnation. But Cayce's readings revealed something more complex, more empowering, and more sobering. That what happens next is deeply dependent on the soul's own recognition of its growth and readiness. The soul is not coerced, it is not tricked, it is not shuttled along by forces beyond its understanding, it chooses. And that choice becomes a declaration of its spiritual maturity. For some souls, the path forward is clear and luminous. They have lived lives of love, service, reflection, and inner expansion. Their spiritual vibration is aligned with higher planes of consciousness. These souls feel a natural pull upward, as if drawn toward a light that pulses with familiarity and welcome. They do not resist it. They follow it with a quiet, humble joy, knowing they are ready to continue their evolution in a realm where learning takes place not through hardship, but through resonance, creativity, and communion with higher truths. These souls move into what Cayce described as spiritual schools, dimensions where the soul deepens its awareness, refines its essence, and prepares to assist others in even more meaningful ways. But not every soul is ready for that step, not because it is unworthy, but because it is unfinished. There are those who, after reviewing their lives, sense that something was left undone. It may be a karmic thread not fully resolved, a relationship severed with words unspoken, a lesson barely touched but not mastered. These souls feel a gentle pull, not upward, but back. Not out of regression, but out of responsibility. And so, they choose to return. To re-enter physical incarnation is not punishment, it is opportunity. It is the soul's decision to continue its evolution through the tactile, messy, beautiful density of life on Earth. Cayce was clear. Reincarnation is not mandatory, it is chosen, and the souls that make this choice do so with clear intention. They may return to rebalance karma, to complete a mission, or to assist another soul in their development. But whatever the reason, the choice to come back is sacred, not imposed. It is the soul saying, "There is still more for me to learn, and more for me to give." Then there is the third path, the soul that remains, not ascending, not reincarnating, but staying close to the earth plane. Cayce spoke of this in many readings, calling it the borderland or the intermediate realm. Here, the soul is not lost, not trapped, but voluntarily positioned. Often, this decision is made out of love. A mother who has just passed may sense her children's vulnerability and choose to stay nearby. A healer may feel their community's need for guidance and anchor their consciousness in a way that offers quiet inspiration to those left behind. These souls become what many might call spirit guides, though they may not always reveal themselves. Their presence is felt in dreams, synchronicities, sudden insights, and moments of unexplained comfort. They have chosen service over ascension, via Celimus, for now. But not all souls who remain in the borderland do so from clarity. Some linger due to attachment, confusion, or unresolved trauma. In these cases, the choice is unconscious. The soul is not punished, but it does experience a kind of stagnation. These souls may hover close to the familiar, drawn to places, objects, or people they are not yet ready to release. Cayce emphasized that even these souls are supported. Spiritual helpers exist in every dimension, gently guiding, never forcing, offering light and clarity until the soul is ready to move. No soul is ever abandoned. The universe is far too merciful for that. The moment of the great choice, then, is not black and white. It is nuanced. It reflects not what a soul deserves, but what it is aligned with. It reflects readiness, vibration, intention. And what makes this so powerful is that it puts the soul in the seat of responsibility. Not responsibility as burden, but as sacred agency. You choose, not as a punishment, but as a reflection of who you are in the light of all you've become. One of the most poignant readings Cayce ever gave described a young soldier who had died in combat. In his review, he experienced both the violence he participated in and the love he had shown to fellow soldiers, often in quiet, unseen ways. After the review, he was given the opportunity to ascend, but he hesitated. He chose instead to remain near Earth to comfort and guide the grieving family he had left behind. For years after his passing, his mother reported feeling his presence, a warmth in the room, a sudden sense of being held. And when Cayce was asked for a reading, it confirmed what the family already sensed. Their son had chosen service over departure, and in doing so, he grew in ways he never could have imagined. This is the hidden beauty of the great choice. It reveals the soul's deeper nature, not the nature it wore in life, not the roles or titles or masks, but the core. The part that seeks truth, that aches to love more fully, that hungers to evolve. And every soul, regardless of its earthly history, is given this opportunity. Even those who passed in confusion, anger, or despair, when they awaken, when they see clearly, they too are invited to choose. Some leap toward the light, others linger to serve, and some return to try again, armed with new awareness. And this is perhaps the greatest truth Cayce's readings offer, that our soul's journey is never one of punishment, but of possibility, that we are never locked into a single fate, that we always have a choice, not just after death, when to, but every day we're alive, because the great choice doesn't begin only when the body dies, it begins now, with every decision to forgive or to withhold, to love or to fear, to awaken or to stay asleep. We are shaping our soul's trajectory in every moment. And when that final moment comes, when the silver cord releases and the review is complete, we will be ready to choose, not because someone tells us what's next, but because we will know. And in that knowing, we will rise, or return, or remain, not in punishment, not in shame, but in sacred purpose. There are moments so powerful, so deeply rooted in love, that not even death can dissolve them. Bonds forged not of words, but of soul recognition, redden, of devotion that transcends lifetimes and identities. In the readings of Edgar Cayce, one of the most touching and revealing truths is this: some souls, even after experiencing the brilliance of the afterlife, the awe of the Great Awakening, and the full clarity of their life review, willingly choose to delay their own spiritual evolution in order to remain near those they love. Not out of fear, not because they are trapped, but because love calls them to stay. One such story, chronicled in a reading Cayce gave during the 1930s, tells of a mother who, upon her passing, entered the borderland not to move forward, but to remain close to her children, proving that real love never ends, it only changes form. The mother, whose name was never disclosed publicly out of respect, had lived a life of quiet resilience. A widow, a caretaker, a protector of her 3 young children, she was known for her gentle spirit and unshakable strength. Her death came unexpectedly, the result of a sudden illness that progressed too quickly for doctors to intervene. Those around her mourned not only her passing, but the impossible gap it left behind. Her children, each under the age of 10, were now in the care of extended family, who struggled to replicate the love and security she had provided so effortlessly. When the family reached out to Cayce for a reading, it wasn't to seek closure, and of the case, it was to seek her. They had felt her presence since her passing, flickers of light in empty rooms, the scent of lavender that once filled her dresser drawers, a child waking from a nightmare feeling an invisible hand brushing his hair. They believed, without question, that she hadn't gone far. They just didn't know how to explain it. Cayce, as always, went into trance, and what came through astonished even the most skeptical in the room. He described her soul in detail, not as a ghost or a wandering spirit, but as a conscious, radiant being who had entered the borderland by choice. This realm, situated energetically close to the earth plane, is not purgatory, it is not punishment. It is, according to Cayce, a layer of existence where souls may choose to remain temporarily when the pull of love is stronger than the call of ascension. In this place, the mother had positioned herself, with, not aimlessly, but with unwavering intention. She was watching over her children, not haunting, not clinging, but guiding, soothing, whispering quiet strength into their hearts when grief threatened to undo them. Cayce explained that the soul had moved swiftly through the initial stages of transition. She had experienced the moment of great awakening, the soft and brilliant detachment from the body, the silver cord review in which she witnessed the totality of her life through the lens of others, her children most of all. She felt their dependence, their innocence, their confusion, and though the light had beckoned her to higher realms, she hesitated. She looked back, not with regret, but with purpose. She felt them calling, not with words but with need, and she answered, not through reincarnation, but through proximity. This is the mystery of the borderland. It is not a place of stagnation, but of sacred waiting. Souls who reside there are often those who have something they wish to complete, not for themselves, but for others. The mother's case was not isolated. Cayce recounted many instances in which souls chose to remain in this in-between state, watching, protecting, guiding, even intervening when their loved ones were in danger or despair. These souls are not denied the chance to progress, they simply postpone it, like a teacher who stays after school to help a struggling student, knowing that their own rest can wait until the work is done. For the mother, that work was her children's healing. Cayce described how she visited them in their dreams, not always in recognizable form, but as a presence they instinctively trusted. She impressed thoughts upon them, nudged their caretakers toward decisions that would protect their innocence, shielded them from accidents they never knew were avoided. Her energy was like a net beneath their feet, invisible but catching them in moments of free fall. And when they cried out in the night, not knowing who they were calling for, she was already there. The beauty of this choice is that it is never forced. Cayce was clear. The mother could have moved on. Her life had been rich with meaning. Her soul had learned deeply, and the light she was offered was vibrant and welcoming. But she loved more than she longed for rest. She chose delay not out of obligation, but out of devotion. And this is what makes the phenomenon so sacred. It proves that love is not confined to flesh, not bound by breath. It is the very structure of spiritual reality. And in that reality, service born of love carries more weight than advancement. There's another layer to her story that Cayce revealed, one that speaks to the far-reaching effects of such selfless choices. By choosing to remain, the mother was not only helping her children, but evolving herself in a different way. She was cultivating spiritual virtues of a higher order, 19 sacrifice, devotion, humility, 19:7, by practicing them not in the physical world, but in the unseen. Her delay was not stagnation. It was elevation through service. And when the time came, when her children had grown, when they were steady and whole, when the cords of dependency had gently loosened, she would step forward into the light she had once turned away from, but with even greater radiance. Her case is one of the most profound demonstrations of what Cayce referred to as soul choice. We often think of spiritual progression as linear, an upward journey through planes of increasing light and knowledge. But Cayce taught that the most evolved souls are not always the ones climbing the highest. Sometimes, they are the ones who pause on the path, turn around, and extend a hand to someone still struggling below. Sometimes the greatest act of growth is to stay a little longer in the darkness, holding a candle for those who are afraid. Many who read Cayce's accounts ask, "How do I know if someone I love is still near me?" The answer, he explained, lies not in dramatic signs, but in subtle certainties. A feeling of being comforted without explanation, a dream that carries more weight than it should, a memory that floods in at just the right moment, a whisper of intuition that saves you from a mistake. These are not coincidences. They are traces of souls who have chosen presence over departure. And what does this mean for us, the living? It means we are not as alone as we sometimes feel. That grief, as deep as it cuts, is not the end of the relationship. That love given and received continues to vibrate across dimensions. That the dead do not forget us. And that some, like the mother in the borderland, are still loving us in ways we can't yet fully understand. Perhaps most powerfully, it invites us to rethink what it means to grow spiritually. It's not always about reaching the next level. Sometimes it's about how deeply we're willing to serve, how long we're willing to wait, how quietly we're willing to love. And when we ourselves one day pass into the light, we may find that we, too, are offered a choice. And perhaps, like her, we'll choose to stay a little longer. For love, there's a quiet truth that flows through the heart of every great spiritual tradition, though often ignored in modern life. The way you live determines the way you die, not in the sense of punishment or reward, but in the deeper, more mysterious way that energy meets its source. In Edgar Cayce's readings, this truth emerged over and over again, reinforced through thousands of sessions. He taught that death is not a singular event, it is a continuation, a seamless passing from one level of awareness to another. And how smooth that passage is, how gentle or turbulent it feels to the soul, depends on the quality of the inner life you cultivated while still in the body. Most people think of preparation for death in terms of logistics, wills, funerals, the settling of accounts, but Cayce pointed to something far more essential: spiritual readiness. According to his readings, the soul does not suddenly become enlightened at the moment of death. It becomes fully conscious of what it already is. Whatever you've built inwardly, whatever you've nurtured in silence, in prayer, in moments of service when no one was watching, becomes your guide. It becomes your bridge into the next reality. And if that bridge has been well tended, the transition is not only smooth, it is beautiful. Cayce often described two types of transitions. The first was what he called the smooth transition, a movement so graceful that the soul barely noticed the shift at first. These were the individuals who had lived lives rooted in awareness, love, and service. They had not been perfect, but they had made spiritual practices a part of their daily rhythm. Prayer had become second nature. Meditation was a gateway to peace. Acts of kindness were given without expectation. When they passed, they did so with a kind of sacred familiarity, as if they were not leaving, but returning. One reading recounted the death of a woman in Virginia who had spent the last 20 years of her life in quiet devotion. She meditated each morning, not out of obligation, but because it was how she aligned herself with something greater. She prayed often, not asking for things, but simply opening her heart in communion. She volunteered at shelters, listened to strangers with compassion, forgave easily, and remained centered even through hardship. When she died, Cayce described her soul lifting from the body like a bird from a tree, soaring into the spiritual realms with clarity, purpose, and joy. There was no confusion, no fear. She was met immediately by familiar guides. Her transition was like stepping through a veil into a more vivid version of what she had always sensed, but could never fully touch. In contrast, there were those whose transitions were marked by turbulence, not because they were evil, but because their consciousness was not yet attuned to spiritual realities. These souls had lived lives dominated by materialism, fear, resentment, or neglect of the inner life. They had not considered the soul's journey, nor had they cultivated the practices that could support them when the physical form was gone. For these souls, Cayce described a kind of disorientation after death, not a period of confusion, where the soul struggled to let go of attachments, unable to fully recognize its new state. They did not suffer eternal punishment, but they wandered. They were not lost, but they were not at peace. The passage had not been prepared. This, Cayce insisted, was preventable, not by adopting dogma, but by deepening awareness. The soul doesn't need grand gestures or flawless devotion. It needs sincerity. It needs space to breathe. It needs moments of stillness and alignment to remember what it is. The tools for this preparation are simple: prayer, meditation, and service. But their effects are profound. Prayer, in Cayce's view, was not about reciting memorized words to a distant deity. It was a conscious opening of the heart, a tuning of one's vibration to the source of all life. He taught that regular prayer creates a resonance in the soul, a kind of spiritual GPS that begins to orient the individual toward higher planes. Over time, this resonance builds a channel of connection, and when death comes, that channel becomes a beacon. The soul recognizes the light because it has walked toward it over and over again in life. Meditation, too, held a central place in Cayce's teachings. It was more than relaxation, a meditation. It was communion. In meditation, the soul begins to separate from the noise of the physical world. It learns to dwell in silence, to listen beyond thought, to feel the subtle presence of the divine within. Meditation teaches the soul how to let go, 1922, which is the very skill required at the moment of death. Those who have practiced surrender through meditation find it easier to release the body, the identity, the attachments. They don't fight the transition, they flow with it. Service, perhaps more than any other practice, shapes the soul's ability to ascend with grace. Cayce repeatedly emphasized that selfless acts done in love create what he called spiritual momentum. Every time you lift someone up, every time you give without seeking praise, you generate a current of energy that lifts not only the recipient, but your own soul. Service anchors the soul in purpose. It creates a kind of spiritual credibility, not in the eyes of others, but in the architecture of the universe. Those who live in service pass with invisible hands already reaching for them. They are met with welcome, because they themselves have welcomed others so many times before. One of the most vivid cases Cayce ever described involved a man who had lived a rough life in his early years, angry, bitter, often destructive. But in the final decade of his life, he underwent a transformation. He began meditating. He reconnected with his family. He volunteered at a veterans' hospital, showing up each day not because he had to, but because he felt called. When he died, his family feared the old version of him would define his transition. But Cayce's reading revealed something else entirely. His soul was greeted with compassion. His efforts had mattered. The momentum of his later years had changed his vibration. His transition, while not without reflection, was peaceful. His newfound service and spiritual discipline had prepared a path of light. The message is clear. It is never too late to begin preparing. Each prayer you speak, each moment of silence you honor, each act of kindness you offer, becomes a stone in the path you'll walk when your body is no longer your home. Death does not come to punish. It comes to reveal. And what it reveals is the architecture of your inner life. If that life has been built with care, devotion, and alignment, then death is not an end, it is a continuation on a higher octave. What Cayce hoped to communicate through his readings was not fear, but empowerment. You are not a passive victim of death, you are an architect of your transition. You shape it every day, every hour, with the choices you make, the presence you bring, the love you offer. The more you tend to the inner life, the more you become familiar with the terrain of spirit. And when the time comes to cross the threshold, it will not feel like a leap into the unknown. It will feel like stepping into a place you've been visiting all along. Cayce believed that the soul's journey is not measured in dramatic revelations, but in quiet consistency. The daily rituals of opening the heart, stilling the mind, and serving with humility build the wings the soul will use when it rises. And as you shape your life with intention, you are simultaneously shaping your death, not with fear, but with grace, not with dread, but with readiness. The question is not, what will happen to me when I die? The question is, how am I living right now? Because the answers to both are one and the same. There are deaths that shake the room with grief, where sorrow lingers like thick smoke, and confusion wraps itself around those left behind. And then, there are deaths so still, so filled with light, that the very air seems to hold its breath in reverence. These are the departures that feel more like ascensions, graceful, natural, transcendent. Edgar Cayce often spoke of such moments in his readings, where the soul doesn't wrench itself from the body in panic or pain, but lifts away like a bird that knows exactly where it's going. He used a metaphor that, over time, became one of the most enduring in his teachings: the bird that soars, a soul that departs not with fear, but with the practiced wings of spiritual preparation, taking flight into realms it already trusts and recognizes. In one of Cayce's most tender case readings, he described the passing of a woman who had lived a life marked not by fame or wealth, but by inward steadiness. She was a schoolteacher in a small town, someone who never sought attention, yet became a cornerstone in the lives of everyone who knew her. She prayed every morning before the sun rose, not for protection or prosperity, but for understanding. She wrote letters of encouragement to former students. She walked barefoot through the woods on Sundays, whispering gratitude to the trees. Her life was a quiet testimony to the sacredness of small things. When her health began to decline in her 80s, she met the news not with panic, but with stillness. Her family, concerned by her declining condition, requested a reading from Cayce. By the time he entered trance, the woman was nearing her final hours, but what he described was not the diminishing of a person, but the unfolding of a soul. He said her transition would be like a bird taking flight from a familiar branch, a phrase that echoed throughout the ARE community for years to come. He explained that her soul, having cultivated a gentle connection to the divine throughout her life, would not need coaxing. She had already built the channels she needed. Her passing would not be abrupt, nor frightening. It would be like inhaling one world and exhaling into another. The metaphor was not poetic exaggeration, it was precise. Cayce saw her soul preparing in ways no medical device could detect. In her final days, Her energy had begun to shift upward. She was detaching, but not in a way that looked like giving up. Instead, it was more like settling into her true self. Her eyes, though often closed, carried a glow of inward presence. She spoke less, but when she did, it was with a kind of clarity that made her loved ones lean in, sensing that her words came from somewhere just beyond the edge of this world. This kind of death is not common, not because it's unreachable, but because it requires a certain rhythm of life. The bird cannot soar unless its wings are strong, and those wings are built long before the moment of flight. In Cayce's readings, the individuals who experienced peaceful, conscious transitions were not those who had perfect lives. They were not saints. They were ordinary people who had lived with awareness, people who made time for prayer, who forgave without needing an apology, who asked big questions even when no one had answers. They didn't wait until their last breath to think about the soul. They had been feeding it all along. Cayce often described how these spiritually prepared souls began their departure before the body fully stopped functioning. The detachment was not abrupt. It was layered, gentle. The soul would gradually withdraw from the dense layers of the physical form, passing through what he called the gates of consciousness, like peeling away heavy garments in preparation for a lighter world. For some, this occurred in dreams, rehearsals, in a sense, where the soul would visit the other side and return. For others, it came through meditative states, where the boundary between the two worlds had already grown thin. The bird that soars does not fear the wind, it has leaned into it many times. The same is true for a soul that has prepared. It recognizes the current of divine energy not as something foreign, but as something it has learned to trust. For such a soul, death is not an interruption, it is a deep breath, a lifting. And the moment it fully releases the body, there is no confusion, only clarity. The familiar branch of physical life falls away beneath, and the soul moves upward into the light that has been quietly calling all along. The woman in Cayce's reading passed peacefully in her sleep, just as he had described. Her family said the moment was unlike anything they had witnessed before. The room grew calm. Her breath slowed, then stopped, but the atmosphere remained thick with presence. They didn't feel her absence. They felt her expansion. It was as if she had grown too vast for the room, and only her body remained behind like a chrysalis, empty but holy. One of her daughters said she imagined a bird lifting off at dawn, wings opening, wind catching, horizon waiting. Stories like this were not rare in Cayce's readings, but they were always sacred. Each time, he reminded people that such peaceful departures were not gifts reserved for the lucky. They were available to anyone who cultivated the inner life. The preparation wasn't about dogma. It wasn't about belonging to the right religion or saying the right prayers. It was about becoming familiar with your soul, learning its language, trusting its journey, making decisions not out of fear or ambition, but out of alignment with something greater. Cayce believed that death, when approached with spiritual awareness, could become the most conscious moment of a lifetime. It could be the unveiling, the final integration of everything the soul had learned. And when that unveiling was met with trust, when the soul recognized the light as its own essence, it would rise, not as a struggle, but as a natural movement upward, a bird returning home. What does this mean for the living? It means we have a choice. We can go through life resisting the unknown, ignoring the quiet whisper of the soul, focusing only on the visible, the tangible, the urgent. Or we can begin now, slowly, gently, cultivating the inner stillness that will carry us when the body grows tired. We can learn to meditate, not as a task, but as a homecoming. We can pray, not to plead, but to align. We can serve others, not for praise, but to remember who we are. The soul that prepares in this way will not fear death. It will not cling or flail. It will recognize the signs. It will feel the winds shifting. And when the moment comes, it will open its wings, not because it has to, but because it is ready. Because it has been preparing for flight all along. That is the gift of spiritual practice. It doesn't just prepare us for death, it prepares us for life. It brings depth to every moment, meaning to every gesture, and clarity to every step. And when the final breath comes, it gives us the strength to rise, not away from life, but into it, in its truest, brightest form. The woman who soared into the light did not leave behind a grand estate or a famous name. She left behind something far more precious, the echo of peace, a life lived in alignment with spirit, a departure that reminded everyone who witnessed it that there is nothing to fear when we have made peace with the soul. That when the time comes, and it always does, we too can rise, not in anguish, but in grace. One of the most comforting revelations in Edgar Cayce's vast archive of readings is also one of the most unexpected. When the soul leaves the body, when it rises beyond the physical plane and begins to integrate into the broader dimensions of spirit, it does not dissolve into some impersonal cosmic soup. It doesn't vanish. It doesn't shed everything that once made it unique. In fact, Cayce described the soul's post-death state not as a loss of identity, but as an expansion of it. The self you've always been, your humor, your values, your emotional tone, even your unique quirks, remains present. But now, those personal traits are bathed in a wider light. You are still you, but you become you without limitation. You don't lose yourself in the afterlife. You finally meet yourself completely. This concept of cosmic awareness is often misunderstood. It is easy to picture the soul's evolution as a process of flattening, of shedding layers until what's left is a quiet, floating nothingness. But Cayce offered a far different vision. He described this expanded state as a kind of blossoming. The soul becomes more itself, not less. Imagine your personality freed from fear, your intelligence unbound by time, your creativity untouched by doubt, your humor still intact, but now seen in the context of eternity, where laughter heals across dimensions. That is cosmic awareness. It is the magnification of your true essence, amplified by divine clarity. Cayce once gave a reading for a man who had recently passed, a father known in life for his quick wit, his love of storytelling, and his compassion disguised behind dry humor. His family, grieving deeply, asked whether their loved one had changed, whether his soul had become something distant or unrecognizable. Cayce's response was simple: he is more himself now than he ever was in life. In the spiritual plane, the man still carried the voice of laughter. He still looked out for those he loved. He was the same soul, but now unburdened by the ego's armor and the body's limitations. His love came through more purely. His jokes carried wisdom. His presence remained familiar, but expanded into a larger field of insight and grace. This revelation brought peace to the family. But more than that, it brought a sense of awe. The idea that death doesn't erase personality, but elevates it, runs counter to so much of what people are taught about the afterlife. We imagine transformation as replacement. But Cayce painted a picture of transformation as revelation. The spiritual self does not overwrite the human self. It completes it. It reclaims the parts that were always there, hidden beneath trauma, conditioning, or distraction. In cosmic awareness, you become everything you were meant to be, without distortion, without denial. That means the interests and passions you held in life do not evaporate when you cross over. They evolve. A musician doesn't lose their connection to sound. They may instead experience it on an entirely new level, hearing the harmonic resonance of spiritual planes and contributing to frequencies that support healing across dimensions. A scientist doesn't abandon curiosity. They gain access to universal principles that transcend material laws. A mother doesn't forget her children. She holds them in a light that transcends time, still guiding, still loving, still whispering strength into their days. Your soul carries memory, not just of the most recent lifetime, but of all lives. But what Cayce found remarkable was how the soul in the early stages after death continues to identify with the most recent incarnation. It still remembers favorite meals, preferred seasons, favorite jokes. It still thinks of certain people with warmth. And yet, alongside that familiar selfhood, there begins to unfold a vast and gentle remembrance, a wider story, a recognition that this one life was only one chapter in an eternal novel. And rather than lose interest in the small things, the soul begins to understand how those small things were never small at all. Cayce described this expanded awareness as both vertical and horizontal. The soul stretches upward, toward divine light, universal law, sacred service. But it also stretches outward, cetateen to the field of relationships, memories, karmic threads, and soul agreements. It sees itself in context. It understands why certain hardships came, why particular people entered its path, why love unfolded or closed down in specific ways. It becomes witness to the grand weave. And in that witnessing, it doesn't feel regret, it feels awe. The soul sees how it played a role in something much greater than personal ambition or struggle. It sees how each joy and sorrow helped shape its tone, and it feels gratitude for having had the chance to live. But cosmic awareness doesn't make the soul cold or untouchable. It deepens its capacity for connection. In fact, Cayce reported that souls who achieve this state are often the ones who choose to become guides, healers, or energetic supporters of those still in physical incarnation. Their awareness of oneness doesn't remove their capacity to love individuals, it enhances it. They know how to stand with someone in grief, not because they're detached from suffering, but because they remember suffering themselves and have learned how to see through it. Their humor is still there, their wisdom more refined, their presence more powerful. In one reading, Cayce explained that a soul who had struggled with low self-worth in life experienced, shortly after death, a sudden expansion of understanding. The soul had seen, during its review, all the people it had inspired without knowing it, moments where a kind word or simple encouragement had changed the trajectory of another's life. With cosmic awareness came the ability to feel those ripples. The soul wept, not out of sadness, but out of overwhelming joy, finally realizing that its life had been meaningful in ways it could never grasp while bound to the physical mind. That soul retained its quiet, introspective nature in the afterlife, i.e., but now bathed in confidence and clarity. It chose to serve as a spiritual presence for others struggling with self-doubt, becoming a frequency of reassurance across time. This is the brilliance of expanded consciousness. It retains specificity while gaining universality. You are still you. You remember your name, your face, your stories, but you also begin to identify more deeply with the soul beneath the name. The being who has walked through centuries, who has loved in countless forms, who has been warrior and poet, servant and teacher, parent and child. You remember your essence, and yet you do not float away into abstraction. You carry your colors with you. You bring your tone, your rhythm, your soul signature into every realm you touch. Cayce wanted people to understand this so they could live without fear, the fear of losing themselves, the fear of annihilation. He taught that spiritual growth was not about erasing the self, but refining it, tuning it like an instrument so it could play in harmony with higher frequencies. Your sense of self is not the obstacle to enlightenment. Your attachment to a false self is. When that attachment falls away, what remains is the soul in its pure form, not still personal, still unique, but infused with cosmic light. So, what does this mean for you, right now, still alive in the body? It means your spiritual practices, your moments of reflection, your self-inquiry, your humor, your kindness, your creative expression, TNICZ. They are not just for this lifetime. They are shaping your soul's identity in ways that will echo far beyond this incarnation. The laughter you share now may become the resonance your soul carries into the afterlife. The love you give now may become the light you extend to others in realms you haven't yet seen. And when the time comes, when your soul slips free of the body and enters the wider field, you will not be a stranger to yourself. You will remember, you will recognize the expanded you, and you will smile, because the truth will no longer be a mystery. You were never meant to disappear. You were meant to become more fully, more brilliantly, more eternally you. He had spent his entire career committed to the physical world, 1902, its systems, its measurements, its cold and verifiable truths. A physician from New York, trained at the finest institutions, surrounded by a community that prized logic over intuition, evidence over emotion, and dismissiveness over the mystical. He believed only in what could be seen, dissected, charted, and diagnosed. To him, talk of souls and afterlives belonged in fiction, or worse, in delusion. That was, until the day his heart stopped beating on the operating table, and everything Edgar Cayce had ever described unfolded before him with terrifying, magnificent precision. His name was never publicly revealed in Cayce's archives, but his case became one of the most referenced and quietly circulated among those familiar with the readings, not because he was famous or charismatic, but because he was the perfect skeptic. A man who had spent decades scoffing at the unseen, only to find himself dragged beyond the veil and humbled by the truth that waited there. His testimony, later shared privately with Cayce in writing, was not laced with spiritual poetry or grand pronouncements. It was clinical, analytical, precise, and yet it confirmed every major theme Cayce had revealed in his sessions: the expansion of consciousness at death, the vivid life review, the presence of loving beings, the continuity of self, and the awakening to a higher order that makes sense of everything we once thought was random. The event that changed everything began during what was supposed to be a routine surgery. The doctor had been experiencing abdominal pain that turned out to be a more serious issue than initially suspected. The operation, while not life-threatening in theory, took a turn when complications emerged: hemorrhaging, a sudden drop in vitals, and then stillness. He flatlined. For several minutes, there was no heartbeat. The surgical team worked feverishly, but during that time, something happened, 100 physical, something the doctor would later struggle to explain, even to himself. He became aware, not dimly, not in fragments, but fully. He was no longer on the table, he was above it, outside it, watching the scene with impossible clarity. He could see the surgeons, the nurses, the flurry of movement, but he also felt something else, an internal shift, a widening. He described it later as an unfolding of light inside my own mind. It wasn't external, yet it seemed to expand in every direction. He knew, with a calm certainty, that he was not dead in the way he had once defined death. He was more alive than ever. But what shocked him even more was the accuracy of what was happening. Because, although he had never taken the Cayce material seriously, he had, years prior, read a few paragraphs from one of Cayce's books during a dinner party debate. At the time, he had laughed it off. But now, mid-flight between realms, those words returned to him with uncanny precision. First came the moment of great awakening, the expansion, the sense that the body was no longer the center of identity, that he was everywhere at once and yet still distinctly himself. He recalled how Cayce had spoken of the soul rising like a bird from a branch. That metaphor, which once seemed sentimental and hollow, now felt literal. He had not fallen into darkness, he had ascended into clarity. Then came the life review, but not in the chronological, shallow way he'd once envisioned. It came in waves, sudden, overwhelming, emotional. He relived moments from childhood, surgeries performed, conversations with patients, offhanded comments to colleagues, moments of kindness, and sharp-edged remarks that he had long forgotten. But more than that, he felt everything from the perspective of others. He became his patients, their fear, their hope, their gratitude, their pain. He felt their vulnerability on the table, their prayers when he walked in the room. He experienced their silent trust in him, and he felt, for the first time, the magnitude of what it meant to hold another person's life in his hands. Cayce had described this exact experience, the mirror of consciousness where the soul becomes the recipient of its own actions, viewed through the eyes and emotions of others. And here it was, happening to a man who had sworn such things were impossible. It was not dramatic, nor was it framed by celestial choirs. It was intimate, it was stunning, and it was true. He later admitted that it was not a feeling of judgment, it was more like knowing, a deep, soul-level recognition of what had been done, what had been left undone, and what it had meant. It was impossible to escape, and yet it wasn't cruel, it was honest. The most profound honesty he had ever encountered. Not one part of it could be debated or justified. And within that honesty came a kind of grace. Not approval, not forgiveness in the religious sense, but clarity. A soft but undeniable voice, dear, wordless yet clear, conveyed, "This is who you've been, and this is what it has taught you. What will you do next?" But the most shocking part of the experience was not the review, it was what followed. He became aware of other presences. They did not speak, they did not appear as angels in robes, but they radiated a calm intelligence, a loving stability that he recognized even though he could not place them. One of them, he sensed, had once been his mentor early in his medical career. Another may have been a brother who had died young, but their identities weren't as important as their essence. They felt like home, and they brought with them no demands, only a kind of invitation. He could sense the choice Cayce had written about, to return, to move forward, or to remain near the earth plane. And though the other side felt radiant and healing, he knew with absolute certainty that he was not done. He had not yet lived with awareness. He had not yet practiced the kind of medicine that the soul was capable of. He had not yet loved the way he now understood love to be. So when he heard the voice of a nurse calling his name, saw the blur of the operating lights once more, and felt the weight of his body return, he did not resist. He came back, and he came back changed. In the weeks that followed, he told no one. How could he? A man so firmly rooted in science, now burdened with an experience that shattered every rule of material reality. But eventually, he reached out to the only person he believed might understand, Edgar Cayce, or rather, Cayce's organization. Through correspondence, he described his experience, and was stunned by the alignment with the readings. The language, the phases, the emotional architecture, one as IOZ's, everything Cayce had described in cases decades before his death had played out in perfect detail. Eventually, he left his practice. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. He began working in palliative care, sitting with the dying, listening to their fears without dismissing them. He no longer needed to debate the afterlife. He had seen it, he had touched it, and he had returned with a mission, to help others prepare their souls, not just their bodies. The man who once scoffed at the word spirit now prayed with patients who asked him to. He meditated each morning, not to escape the world, but to stay aligned with what he had seen beyond it. And though he rarely spoke publicly about his experience, those who spent time with him sensed something, a stillness, a depth, a sense that this was a man who had crossed a line and brought something back. His story became part of Cayce's legacy not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. A skeptic whose rational mind was so well honed that when it was finally shattered by the truth, it recorded every detail with precision. His experience became living evidence of what Cayce had known all along: death as soul does not end. That death is not the dark unknown, but the great remembering. And that even the most skeptical heart can be cracked open by the undeniable brilliance of truth when the time comes to pass through the veil. Not every soul that transitions chooses to move on immediately to higher realms of learning or reincarnation. Some remain close, not because they are lost or unwilling to evolve, but because they have chosen to serve. Edgar Cayce's readings revealed again and again that many souls, upon passing through the veil of physical life and entering the spiritual dimension, are given a choice. And for some, especially those whose hearts were devoted to love and purpose during their time on earth, that choice leads them not away from us, but toward us. These are the souls who continue to guide, protect, and inspire from the other side, not as ghosts or restless spirits, but as conscious allies in the great unseen architecture of human experience. Service doesn't end with death. For many souls, it deepens. Cayce described these beings as radiant presences who remain vibrationally connected to the earth plane. They are no longer limited by time or physical location. They do not experience exhaustion or frustration in the same way we do. They are freed from the weight of the body, the distractions of ego, the veil of separation. And in that freedom, they can reach us more purely, through dreams, sudden insight, intuition, synchronicity, and emotional resonance. This isn't just wishful thinking. Cayce's readings detailed many cases where souls chose to delay their ascent into more rarefied realms in order to continue working on behalf of those still navigating earthly life. Sometimes, this choice is made out of love for specific individuals, a parent watching over a child, a friend offering strength during a time of grief, but often, it comes from a larger calling. These are souls who, even while incarnated, were drawn to roles of service, healers, teachers, caregivers, spiritual seekers, and when they pass, they do not see their journey as finished, they see it as expanding. They become what Cayce referred to as spiritual companions, not physical apparitions, but subtle presences, working in harmony with divine law to influence and support without interfering. These souls understand the boundaries of free will. They do not control or manipulate. They do not dictate decisions. Instead, they create what Cayce called spiritual opportunities, circumstances that support growth, insights that seem to appear from nowhere, timely nudges that steer us when we most need direction. Consider the moments in your life when you felt protected for no logical reason, the car that narrowly missed you, the meeting you almost cancelled but didn't, and it changed everything. The sentence in a book that felt like it was written just for you, or the inner whisper that said, "Wait," or "Go," and you listened, even though it made no sense at the time. According to Cayce, these are not random. They are signs that someone, a soul who loves you, or even one you've never met, is guiding from behind the scenes. One of the most beautiful cases Cayce documented involved a young boy who had lost his older sister in a tragic accident. The family was devastated, and the boy, barely 5 years old, became withdrawn and fearful. He refused to sleep alone. He spoke of seeing her, hearing her voice, but no one quite knew how to respond. Cayce was asked for insight, and during the reading, he confirmed what the boy had been trying to say all along. His sister had chosen to remain nearby, not as a lost spirit, but as a protector. She was present in his dreams, wrapping her light around him when he felt afraid, and gently working through the adults in his life to make sure he received the love and safety he needed to grow. These spiritual servants often work through others, that teacher who sensed exactly what you needed to hear, that stranger who appeared just in time to help, that friend who called you at the exact moment your heart was breaking. Cayce described this phenomenon as the soul's ability to impress thoughts, suggestions, and energies into the minds and hearts of those attuned to the higher frequencies of compassion and awareness. They do not override our choices. They simply shine light where it's most needed, and leave it to us to respond. What's even more extraordinary is that this service is not limited to family ties or past relationships. Some souls choose to become guides for those they never knew in physical life. They are drawn by resonance, by the frequency of someone's spiritual striving, or by a shared mission. Cayce said that many people working in healing professions, artistic channels, and social justice work are surrounded by spiritual helpers they may never consciously perceive, but whose presence becomes obvious through bursts of creativity, resilience during hardship, and the courage to speak or act when it's most needed. In the unseen realms, geography and blood are less important than energy and intention. A soul in service moves where it's most needed, where it can be most useful. And often, these souls take on multiple assignments. They may assist more than one person, or remain close to a community, a cause, or even a place where healing and transformation are taking place. Churches, hospitals, schools, and homes where deep spiritual work is being done are often surrounded by what Cayce described as circles of light, conscious beings who hold the energy, stabilize it, and protect it. This work is not glamorous, it's not dramatic, but it is sacred. These souls are not trying to be noticed. They are simply continuing what they began in life. Only now, they do it with expanded awareness, and without the limitations of a body. And just as some souls choose to stay behind out of personal love, others are completing agreements, karmic promises made long before birth, where two souls commit to help each other evolve, even if it means one must remain unseen for a time. The presence of such beings is often felt during great turning points: illness, loss, spiritual awakening, decisions that will alter the course of a life. In those moments, time seems to bend. The right person shows up. The impossible becomes possible. And deep within, a part of you knows, this was not chance. This was love, working silently, a soul who saw you and answered. And this is not just about the help we receive, it's also about what we might one day become. Cayce taught that we are not only the recipients of spiritual guidance, we are being prepared to offer it. The lives we live now, the love we cultivate, the compassion we extend, these are not just for this lifetime, they are seeds for our own potential service. One day, when our bodies are gone, we may be the ones offering light to someone still struggling in the fog of earthly life. And if we live with intention now, if we choose love over fear, presence over distraction, we are already becoming the kind of soul that others can lean on when they cannot stand. So what does it look like to live with this awareness? It means recognizing that you are not alone, that the sudden strength you feel in crisis, the forgiveness that rises in your heart even when it's hard, the clarity that comes after prayer or silence, these are often echoes of someone loving you from beyond. It means listening more closely to intuition. It means speaking the words that arrive from nowhere but feels sacred. It means trusting that the invisible world is not empty, but full of souls, who serve not for recognition, but out of love. And perhaps most importantly, it means remembering that death is not a wall, it's a veil. And behind that veil are not only truths and mysteries, but friends, family, and companions of spirit who are still walking with us. They don't need to be seen to be real. Their love is evident in the way the light returns after the storm, the way you rise when you thought you couldn't, the way something in you insists on hope even when the world tells you to give up. These are not accidents, they are answers. And the hands that reach for us in the dark may very well belong to those who once walked beside us in life and chose, even after death, to keep holding on. It often begins quietly, a strange coincidence that tugs at your attention. A song plays just as you're thinking of someone who passed. A clock repeatedly reads the same time when something important happens. You feel the urge to take a different route home, and on that route, you meet someone who changes your life. These are not random. In Edgar Cayce's teachings, these moments are not only real, they are sacred. They are the fingerprints of a greater intelligence operating just beyond the veil. They are the work of transitioned souls, of spiritual allies, gently guiding us, nudging us, intervening just enough to keep us aligned with a higher path. Cayce spoke often of what he called spiritual opportunities. These are orchestrated openings, subtle windows in time and space through which the soul can evolve, awaken, or heal. They often appear disguised as chance, but they are anything but accidental. When a soul leaves the physical body and enters the spiritual realms, its work is not over. Especially for those who have chosen to remain near the earth plane in service, their role shifts from direct action to influence, delicate influence. They are no longer bound by speech, but their message is clear. They no longer touch with hands, but they move through energy, impression, and synchronicity. The universe speaks softly when it wants you to truly listen. This is the realm in which these souls operate. They do not crash into your life with thunder and lightning. They drop symbols, phrases, repeated patterns, feelings that pulse through your intuition. They rearrange the seemingly mundane in ways that seem invisible until you step back and look again. Cayce described this as the music between the notes, a kind of divine intelligence working in the background of our lives, orchestrated by loving souls who still care about our path, our healing, and our awakening. One of the most profound aspects of these interventions is how personal they feel. You might be walking through a bookstore, and suddenly a book falls at your feet. You pick it up and find that it contains the exact wisdom you didn't know you needed. Or you might be in grief, aching from the absence of someone you loved deeply, when you see their favorite flower blooming out of season, alone, bright, and unmissable. These are not random artifacts. These are curated messages, spiritual nudges, and according to Cayce, they often come from souls who once walked beside us, and now walk above us, gently sending reminders that we are not forgotten, not abandoned, not alone. Cayce emphasized that the soul's ability to receive these messages is not determined by spiritual superiority, ISI, it's determined by receptivity. He urged people to develop quietness of mind, to cultivate intuition, to pay attention to feeling and not just fact. Because the signs are always there, but most people are too busy, too skeptical, or too afraid to notice. The spiritual realm does not force its way into your life. It invites, it hints, it allows you to choose whether you will open your eyes to what's already occurring. He also spoke of layered synchronicities, those moments that seem small on their own, but in hindsight form a pattern so precise it could not have been designed by chance. A woman he once read for described a sequence of events that began with a dream about her deceased mother. In the dream, her mother said only one thing: "Look for the yellow door." She awoke puzzled. Days later, she was invited to a gathering in a part of town she rarely visited. As she walked toward the house, she realized her stomach was turning. Something about the moment felt important, but she didn't know why until she reached the house. The front door was painted bright yellow. When she stepped inside, she met someone who would later become her business partner in a healing retreat center that would change not only her life, but many others. Could she have dismissed the dream? Absolutely. Could she have ignored the door? Of course. But she didn't. She listened. And by doing so, she stepped into a spiritual opportunity that had been lovingly set in place by something, or someone, beyond the veil. Cayce would call this the mother's hand at work, shaping an invisible blessing into visible form. These spiritual nudges don't always lead to grand transformations. Sometimes they are moments of comfort, a light that flickers in a room just as you speak someone's name, a bird that lands on your window every morning after a funeral, a sudden scent that fills the room. Familiar, specific, impossible to explain. These are not figments of grief. They are echoes of connection. They are the soul's way of reminding you, love does not die, and those who love you are not gone. They have simply moved to a different seat in the theater of your life, still watching, still participating, still sending light. Cayce encouraged people to talk to their loved ones who had passed, not in desperation, not to seek constant signs, but to keep the channel of communication open. He said that love is the most powerful transmitter between realms. And when that love is focused, intentional, and sincere, it creates a resonance that makes spiritual contact more likely. You may not hear a voice, you may not see an apparition, but you may feel calm where there was fear, insight where there was confusion, strength where there was weakness. These are the gifts of the unseen, the quiet miracles of spiritual companionship. In one particularly moving reading, Cayce spoke of a soul who had passed during childbirth. Her husband, left to raise their newborn alone, was consumed by depression and guilt. But Cayce assured him she had not left. In fact, she was with the child constantly, helping him sleep, wrapping warmth around him in the early hours, whispering songs into his dreams. And more astonishingly, she was also working through the father, to PT, urging him toward a future he had not yet imagined. The man later went on to found a home for single parents, something he would never have considered before his loss. He credited his late wife with the vision, though he couldn't explain how the idea came to him. Cayce's reading confirmed she had planted the seed, gently, lovingly, without needing to be seen. This is the essence of a spiritual nudge. It is never coercive. It is an offering. It may come in the form of a book that catches your eye, a sentence someone says that resonates like a bell, a memory that floats in without cause but brings sudden clarity. And over time, if you trace them, you'll see that they form a constellation, map of the invisible network that surrounds you, holds you, and helps you course correct when the world feels uncertain. Cayce believed that as more people become attuned to these signs, the easier it becomes for the spiritual realm to interact with us. It's like a doorway that opens wider the more often it's used. And each time we acknowledge a synchronicity, each time we act on intuition, each time we listen to the quiet voice that says, "Wait," or "Speak now," we strengthen that connection. We become co-creators with the unseen. We turn life into a conversation with the divine. In a world that moves fast, that demands proof, that reduces meaning to statistics and coincidence, this kind of perception is revolutionary. But it is not naive, it is ancient. Cultures long before ours understood the language of signs. They trusted dreams. They read the wind. They followed the rhythm of inner knowing. Cayce's readings were not an invention of something new. They were a reminder of something deeply old and urgently needed. You are being guided more than you realize. Not every sign will be loud. Not every moment will feel sacred. But the more you trust that the universe is alive with intention, that love survives death, that souls choose to serve from beyond, that nothing meaningful is ever truly lost, the more you'll begin to notice how supported you are. The path is not random. It is written in light, and those who love you are helping to hold the pen. Death is not a stranger waiting to steal your final breath. It is not the cruel end of everything you've built, loved, or become. According to Edgar Cayce's readings, death is not even the opposite of life. It is the continuation of it. A return to where you began, a homecoming. And how your soul experiences those first 60 seconds after your last heartbeat is not random, nor is it entirely dependent on fate. It is shaped, moment, by how you live now. Your awareness, your intentions, your spiritual posture, all of these influence the clarity, peace, and meaning you will carry with you as you step through the veil. For Cayce, preparing for death wasn't morbid, it was essential, because the first few seconds of transition are among the most critical moments a soul will ever face. They are a crossing point, a spiritual mirror that reflects everything you've anchored your heart to while in the physical form. If you've lived in fear, in avoidance, or in the sleep of forgetfulness, those first seconds can feel disorienting. But if you've lived with spiritual expectancy, with the deep knowing that you are more than your body, more than your job, more than your pain, then death becomes not a collapse, but an awakening, not a void, but a reunion. And yet, this preparation is not about obsession. It is not about anxiously rehearsing your final moments, or trying to manipulate what comes after. It's about alignment. It's about tending the inner garden of your soul, so that when the wind of transition blows, you rise naturally, drawn by light, not pulled by confusion or regret. The way you live each day becomes the map your soul will read when the body falls away. So what does it mean to live with that kind of expectancy? First, it means remembering, not just in the sense of intellectual belief, but deep, embodied remembrance, that you are a spiritual being, that you existed before you were born, that this lifetime is not your first, and it won't be your last. Cayce taught that the soul chooses each incarnation as a learning ground, and that your higher self is aware, even now, of the broader arc of your journey. When you live from this perspective, it changes your priorities. You begin to care more about growth than appearance, more about service than success, more about presence than performance. You become someone who asks deeper questions, listens more fully, and forgives more easily, not because you're trying to earn your way into heaven, but because your soul remembers that love is your natural state. Preparing your soul also means tending to your emotional life. Unresolved, guilt, hatred, bitterness, and fear act like anchors in the subtle body. Cayce warned that these emotions can create density in the soul, making the initial transition more turbulent. Not because you're being punished, but because you haven't yet released the weight that keeps you earthbound. Forgiveness, then, becomes a vital spiritual practice, not just for others, but for yourself. When you forgive, you let go of the energetic threads that tether you to past pain. You free your own soul to rise cleanly when the time comes. Meditation, too, plays a key role, not as a performance, but as a daily return to silence. A reminder that underneath the noise of the mind, there is a stillness that belongs to eternity. Cayce often said that those who cultivate inner quiet find the transition into spirit much smoother, because they've already been visiting the spiritual realms in their meditative states. Death does not shock them. It simply extends what they've already touched in their inner life. And then there is service, the most powerful spiritual catalyst of all. Cayce emphasized that living in service to others aligns the soul with divine law. When you give without expectation, when you speak a word of kindness, when you make space for someone's grief, When you offer your time, your love, your attention, these acts accumulate. They are recorded not in some external ledger, but in the soul's vibration. When the time comes to leave this body, that vibration guides you like a beacon. Service creates light, and that light is what calls you home. But this isn't just about doing good deeds. It's about authenticity, about living your truth, speaking from your heart, and aligning your actions with your values. The soul recoils from hypocrisy. It longs for coherence. When your outer life reflects your inner convictions, there is peace. And peace, Cayce taught, is the soul's natural launch pad. It allows the spirit to rise without friction. Living with spiritual expectancy also means making peace with death, not in some abstract way, but as a companion that walks beside you, reminding you to live fully. When you remember that time is short, you begin to choose differently. You say what needs to be said, you take risks, you savor beauty, you laugh more, you let go of what doesn't matter. You live as if this moment counts, because it does. And this kind of presence, this rootedness in the now, becomes a spiritual practice in and of itself. There are also practical steps Cayce recommended: writing letters to loved ones, not out of fear, but as a sacred act of clarity, creating rituals of closure, making amends, saying thank you, letting people know what they mean to you, not because the end is near, but because love should never be postponed. These actions clear the field, they prepare the soul by softening the heart. And then there is curiosity. Cayce spoke of souls who approached death, not with dread, but with wonder. Like stepping into a great mystery with wide eyes and an open heart. These are the souls who ascend quickly. They are not clinging, they are not afraid, they are explorers returning home. To live with that kind of curiosity now, about who you are, about what life is teaching you, about how your soul is unfolding, is to prepare the inner landscape for a beautiful departure. The truth is, the first 60 seconds after death are not a performance review. They are an unveiling. Everything you are, everything you've loved, feared, carried, denied, embraced, will be seen with astonishing clarity. But that moment doesn't have to be overwhelming. It can be luminous, familiar, even joyful. Cayce described some souls laughing in those first seconds, not out of mockery, but from the sheer relief of remembering who they really are. They saw the game for what it was. They saw the love that was always beneath the surface. And they rose. That kind of transition is not reserved for saints. It is available to anyone who chooses to live consciously now, to listen to the quiet urges of the soul, to treat each moment as sacred, to prepare not through fear, but through love. And perhaps most importantly, preparing your soul for death means recognizing that this isn't just about you. Your clarity, your growth, your peace, these ripple outward. Your awakening becomes an invitation for others to awaken. Your light becomes a path others can follow when their own vision dims. You are not just preparing for a personal homecoming, you are participating in a collective return to truth. So let the preparation begin, not with anxiety, but with reverence, with deep breaths, with honest reflection, with love in action. Let your days become prayers. Let your thoughts become offerings. Let your choices become declarations of your eternal nature. Because one day, perhaps sooner than you expect, you will take that first step beyond. You will leave the body, you will feel lightness, you will remember. And in those first 60 seconds, your soul will either tremble in confusion or smile with recognition. Live now, so that when that moment comes, you do not say goodbye. You say, "Ah, there you are. I remember now. I'm home."